Science Fiction University.
Hello and welcome to Science Fiction University.
We're your fan and writer hosts. I'm Blue Gal.
And I'm Driftglass, and you can visit Science Fiction University at our website, sciencefictionuniversity.com, where you can also contribute to this podcast. There is a Patreon button at our website, or you can mail us a letter and or contribution to Science Fiction University, P.O. Box 9133, Springfield, Illinois, 62791. And here comes the spoiler warning. This episode contains spoilers and surprising revelations about a 1963 film, a 1973 film, and a 1993 film, as well as possible collateral spoilers for Black Sunday, The Andromeda Strain, Captain America, The Day of the Jackal, Mimic, and or I Am Legend, and basically anything else we might come across as we think this through and talk about it on today's podcast.
The theme of today's show is Mother Nature USMC, and it's about a subgenre of science fiction in which human beings try to bend nature to their will, usually, but not always, with disastrous results. Now, there are a lot of these kinds of stories in science fiction going all the way back to Frankenstein. Scientists tampering with things they shouldn't have, attempting to play God. And it makes sense because ever since the giant black monolith appeared on the African savanna and gave us monkeys the ability to use a bone as a club, we've been repurposing nature for our own ends.
Can you tell we watched 2001: A Space Odyssey recently?
Yeah, that was the first movie we watched this weekend. And the rest of the movies we watched this past weekend were for this podcast. So.
Oh, and fun fact, in Arthur Clarke's novelization, it's not a bone, it's a knot, a K-N-O-T knot that human beings learn to tie. That's the beginning of human evolution, intelligence, civilization. So anyway,
getting back to the show, we're going to narrow that genre down to a more specific topic, tampering with nature for military or civic purposes, which people have also been doing forever.
Yeah.
Genghis Khan and the Mongols with their horses, and the Mongols once again in the mid-1300s when they broke a 3-year siege of the city of Kaffa on the Black Sea by using plague-infested cadavers and feces as biological weapons by catapulting them over the walls of the city. Can you imagine?
Poo-flinging.
Literally.
As a biological assault, yeah.
Yep. There was Hannibal and the Carthaginian army. Nope. Am I saying that right? Carthaginian army with their elephants. And Hannibal, once again, who won a naval victory over the king of Pergamon by firing clay pots full of snakes onto the opposing king's ships.
I have had it with these motherfucking snakes on this motherfucking plane!
Finally, in 600 BCE, Solon, the legislator of the Athenians, defeated his enemies by contaminating a river that was the water supply of his enemies with a plant root that gave them violent diarrhea.
You know, the rule about you never follow kids, dogs, or farts in vaudeville. I'm going to do my best, though, because it's no surprise that this sort of thing shows up in lots of science fiction, too. The 1971 classic, The Andromeda Strain, which I love dearly, and which we will definitely get to soon, is about the U.S. government looking for a viable biological weapon in space and finding one that it cannot control. Bad things happen. And the very good 1997 movie Mimic, in response to a plague in New York City that's killing children and for which there is no cure or vaccine, entomologist Dr. Susan Tyler genetically engineers what she calls the Judas breed, a hybrid between a mantis and a termite that effectively wipes out the cockroaches which are carrying the disease, which is a good thing. Unfortunately, 3 years later, things go horribly, horribly wrong. And for this episode, we're going to dial in even more specifically on animals in science fiction, which are, for lack of a better term, people-sized. So no microscopic stuff, no things the size of Godzilla or King Kong, although those are fun. I love my giant ants. I love my giant spiders. We'll get to those one day. And we're going to start more or less in the chronological middle of our quadruple feature with a strange and forgotten cult classic from 1973 called The Day of the Dolphin, which fits very comfortably among the much better known paranoid political thrillers that were huge in the 1970s. These movies were the filmmakers and screenwriters' reaction to a decade of riots and bombings, police-led Gestapo tactics against protesters in Chicago, the murder of student protesters by National Guardsmen at Kent State in 1970, seemingly endless political assassinations, the publication of the Pentagon Papers in 1971, the escalating body count and horror stories coming out of Vietnam, and of course, Watergate.
If you weren't around then and going to the movies in the early 1970s, it might be hard to understand just how saturated we were with political thrillers by heavyweight directors.
Yeah, it was a thing.
In 1971, there was Alan J. Pakula's Klute, starring Jane Fonda. This would be the first of what came to be known as Pakula's Paranoia trilogy. It was followed by The Parallax View in 1974 and All the President's Men in 1976. All films dealing with themes of paranoia, conspiracies, and surveillance. And Donald Sutherland is actually very, very wonderful in Klute. I highly recommend going to watch that movie for Donald Sutherland's performance. It's very understated.
Everybody has seen, I hope, All the President's Men. I mean, it's sort of the big dog in this. But yeah, Klute is amazing. The Parallax View is amazing.
Yes.
They're wonderful movies. And they're just kind of a little bit lost in time because we don't have movies like that anymore.
Right. There was Day of the Jackal, a 1973 political thriller, another one, about an assassination attempt against French President Charles de Gaulle in the summer of 1962. In 1974, there was Francis Ford Coppola's The Conversation, starring Gene Hackman, another wonderful performance.
Great movie, just great.
This movie is about political assassinations and overheard conspiracies, and also paranoia, for sure.
And they bring back that Hackman character, sort of. It's intended to be so in Enemy of the State with Will Smith in the 1990s. They bring him back as the older paranoid version of the same character. So great performance by Gene Hackman.
In 1975, one of my favorite movies of all time, Sidney Pollack's 3 Days of the Condor, which starred Robert Redford, Faye Dunaway, and Cliff Robertson, and was about political assassinations and accidentally discovered conspiracies. And I love this movie because Robert Redford plays a non-combatant.
Right,
he's somebody who reads books for a living, and but reading books for a living gives him all kinds of skills by which to defeat the CIA bad guys
and
who have computers and security. And he's able to sort of knowledge his way around them. Very, very good movie. John Schlesinger's 1976 Marathon Man starred Dustin Hoffman, Laurence Olivier, Roy Scheider, and William Devane. And guess what it's about? Murder and conspiracy. But this one has Nazis.
Oh, yeah.
1977, a fake Mars landing in a movie called Capricorn 1 was a big hit, as was John Frankenheimer's film Black Sunday about a planned terrorist attack at the Super Bowl. And now we come to our 1973 feature, The Day of the Dolphin, a movie about using intelligent talking dolphins to try to assassinate the President of the United States. And it fits right into this whole theme that we've been talking about, 1970s political thrillers regarding assassination. Day of the Dolphin had a big name director, Mike Nichols, and man, he was on a hell of a run at this point. He had done Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf in 1966, The Graduate in 1967, Catch-22 in 1970, Carnal Knowledge in 1971, and he had director's cut in his contract. I mean, amazing power in Hollywood. And here he is making Day of the Dolphin with his longtime partner, screenwriter Buck Henry, big name. Buck Henry had been Nichols' screenwriter on both The Graduate and Catch-22. Day of the Dolphin starred George C. Scott, who had just 2 years earlier won the Academy Award for Best Actor for Patton. Scott refused the Oscar because he hated the idea of actors being in competition with each other. So, Day of the Dolphins. It can't miss, right? This is going to be an amazing movie. It's got all of this high caliber talent in it.
This pedigree. this amazing pedigree.
Yep.
And, it didn't quite flop, but it wasn't quite great. But you know what it is? It is science fiction. And you can't fault me for that. And it's definitely kind of offbeat. Now, I liked this movie when I saw it with my dad at the movies in the 1970s. My dad loved this kind of movie. We went to go see like the Boggy Creek Monster and, the Chariots of the Gods. He was into all that sort of weird stuff. So we went to go see movies like this a lot. And I liked it. And I liked it again when we watched it for this podcast. Also, just FYI, this is the second Science Fiction University movie we had to buy online because you cannot stream this anywhere.
Yeah.
And let me assure you, we got our $3.95 worth because we watched the hell out of this thing, including all the featurettes, the interviews with some of the actors who were talking about landing their roles and working with George C. Scott and the weeks they spent in the Bahamas with nothing to do, and so on and so forth. We also listened to the commentary from film historians Howard S. Berger and Nathaniel Thompson and figured out the reason why this movie just doesn't quite work. First of all, this is really two entirely different movies trying to coexist. The first movie is, beloved by me, science fiction. It's about an experiment in interspecies communication between dolphins and humans conducted on a remote island. And those scenes are great. Just terrific, because other than Buck Henry off camera pretending to be the dolphin, when you hear Alpha and saying, that's Buck Henry standing 10 feet away making dolphin noises. Other than that, there are no special effects in those scenes. These really are a troupe of actors on an island for many weeks swimming with dolphins. It's in real tanks and in the real ocean. The camera work is kind of tricky. During the interviews, they talked about how hard it is to shoot on water, but all the interactions are real. And the ending, where George C. Scott has to send his beloved dolphins away to save their lives, is genuinely sad and moving. I mean, I really felt it when I was a kid, and I felt it when we watched it again. Now, the other movie going on in this space is a very typical 1970s conspiracy thriller. A board of directors of the mysterious Franklin Foundation, which funds the dolphin research and a bunch of other things, turns out to actually be a cabal of wealthy businessmen led by Fritz Weaver and my favorite, John Daner, who's smoking a cigar the entire time and is just an asshole, a total villain. I love him. I've heard him on the radio. He's been in 1,000 things, and he's really, really good in this. But they plan to use those dolphins to assassinate the president of the United States. Oh, my God. Because the president's going to be on a yacht surrounded by security, and who can get past all the security other than dolphins swimming under the water being stealthy and cool? And the mysterious fake journalist played by none other than Paul Sorvino, who blackmails his way onto the island and has been stalking the research team, who you think is the bad guy. Well, you know what? Turns out to be the good guy. And these two very different movies never quite managed to fit comfortably together.
That's true. The second flaw with this movie is the screenwriting. And we watched, as one of the DVD extras, an interview about The Day of the Dolphin with screenwriter Buck Henry. He said that he probably was not the right guy to write this script because he wasn't skilled at writing the kind of tense, paranoid, multi-layered dialogue that this sort of film needed. He was fine at writing the scenes with the dolphins. They were realistic and they had emotional depth. You really got a sense that the dolphins were had a parental relationship with George C. Scott. He called him father.
No, they called him Pa.
And Fa was Alpha, right? That's right. That's right.
And George C. Scott's wife was Ma. So Pa, Ma, Fa,
Trish
and
Vanderveer, Pa and Ma.
Yeah. And the Alpha and
so
B.
they all had these sort of deep emotional relationships. And as Driftglass said earlier, when he has to say goodbye to the dolphins and say, you have to go away, there are bad men. And if you don't go away, I'll get hurt. George E. Scott was saying, bad men are coming to hurt me. If you're here, they'll hurt me. And so these dolphins have this total sense of sacrifice that they will leave and not talk anymore.
And there's a scene with John Daner, of course, because he's an asshole, where we learn that dolphins cannot do abstractions.
Yep.
Everything is literally true or not true, and they don't know how to lie. They're very Vulcan in that way. They don't know how to lie. They can't lie. So when John Daner's trying to sort of figure out if he can control them by asking them questions like, well, let's suppose there's a shark in the tank. And George C. Scott says that you can't do that. And okay, let's just say there's a shark in the tank, and the dolphins bolt. They jump the fence. They run away because as George C. Scott loses his temper and said, I fucking told you, they don't understand abstraction. So George C. Scott has to tell them at the end that he doesn't exist anymore. Pa not. That's all they know. The death they don't understand, but not they do understand. And it's really sad because he has to basically angrily orphan his children to save their lives and do it angrily so that they get it through their heads that they have to leave right now.
Yeah. But that half of the movie doesn't go along with the assassinate the president thriller.
No, it really doesn't.
And interestingly enough, I don't think there's anything about the assassination plot that hinges on the dolphins being able to talk.
No.
The dolphins are smart and they understand and can recognize flags and shapes. And that's illustrated earlier in the film, that they can go and grab a triangle or a square or a circle so they can understand the president's flag on a presidential boat to go and bomb it, to have a bomb strapped to them and go bomb this boat. But they don't need their language capabilities to assassinate the president.
No.
And that's a weakness in this plot.
But they do need to be able to understand language because the way they basically blackmail the dolphins into doing this is to tell them that Pa is waiting for you. Pa is on the boat. Pa will be here when you get here. So that keeps them calm. And when you get back from your mission, Pa will be here. So they lie to them. And since dolphins don't understand lying,
absolutely,
that's how it works.
They're able they believe everything these bad people are saying to them. And another fault of this movie we learn from the extras on the DVD is, to put it charitably, George C. Scott was difficult to work with. Go figure.
Yeah.
He had a volcanic temper. He had access to alcohol. And he's on this island. They're trapped on this island pretty much the whole shoot. And so George C. Scott and his volcanic temper did not make filming this movie smooth.
Or pleasant, yes.
Or pleasant.
Yeah.
Finally, or furthermore, the project was taken on by director Mike Nichols as a contractual fulfillment. He needed to make one more picture for the studio. He had to get done, let's do this one. And that last obligatory film on the contract, so that he could move on to other projects, meant he probably picked something for speed rather than passion.
Yeah.
On the other hand, that feeling of obligation to his financiers was clearly something that Nichols wove into the plot of the movie. And also Buck Henry wove into the plot of the movie. The conflict between creativity and commerce, the joy of working on pure research with no expectations of results versus the demands of the marketplace and who's footing the bills. For more on this, we turn to a certain paranormal researcher, Dr. Ray Stantz.
Personally, I like the university. They gave us money and facilities. We didn't have to produce anything. You've never been out of college. You don't know what it's like out there. I've worked in the private sector. They expect results.
And of course, that's from Ghostbusters. This was the same conflict which was constantly being negotiated between directors like Mike Nichols and the studio, which is paying for everything. And being negotiated between directors like Nichols, who have a budget and a timetable, even if they have director's cut, they still have to deal with temperamental actors like George C. Scott, whose mood swings can throw everything else into chaos.
Yep.
However, saying all of that, it must be said that Day of the Dolphin has one of the best, oh shit, moments in movie history.
Yeah, literally.
Yep.
Guy looks out a porthole, says, oh shit, then a thing happens. And that's all we'll say, because who knows, you might want to watch this movie one day, but it really is quite well done. That's a Buck Henry move, and that's really well done.
Yep.
Now, the historian's commentary also cracked us up because it touched on several of the films like Black Sunday and The Parallax View that we were already going to mention during this podcast. We already had notes, and those were among my notes about stuff to touch on. But the one thing I swear to God we never expected in a million years was for the historians to name check our next film, Warner Brothers' 1963 goofy blend of animation and live action, The Incredible Mr. Limpet, starring Don Knotts. That blew us away. That just
all of
blew
a
us away.
sudden,
Like,
all of a
what?
sudden, we're watching Day of the Dolphin, listening to the commentary, and they say, "Oh, by the way, Mr. Limpet,
Yeah, like,
the
what?
incredible Mr. Limpet." Like, what?
Are you magic? Are you time travelers? How did you know? How could you possibly know? Because we'd already decided to pair the story of Henry Limpet, which is was marketed by Warner Brothers as a fun family movie, with the Day of the Dolphin, because who in their right mind other than us would ever think of such a thing? But we did. Now, I am pretty sure I saw Mr. Limpet as a very little kid at the drive-in, probably the same drive-in where my mom had taken us to see a bunch of other Don Knotts films like The Ghost of Mr. Chicken and The Reluctant Astronaut and The Shakiest Gun in the West, all of which I loved. And then I picked up the DVD in some bargain bin somewhere so we could play it for our kids. Now, in most movies, and if you've ever watched The Andy Griffith Show, you know it's definitely true in The Andy Griffith Show, Knotts plays a scrawny, self-important, very romantic, high-strung guy who's always bragging about things he can't do, which gets him into trouble. But in The Incredible Mr. Limpet, he does not do this. Instead, he plays a bookkeeper working at a shipping company in 1941 who is deeply patriotic and repeatedly tries to join the Navy and fails to do so because he is weak and scrawny and nearsighted. True, he is a stereotypically henpecked husband, and his closest friend is big and loud and physically fit sailor. But honestly, the closest parallel to the Limpet origin story is, and I'm absolutely not kidding about this, Steve Rogers, the proverbial 4F 98-pound weakling who is transformed into a graceful, strong hero who leads the Allies to victory in World War II.
Absolutely. Now, in Steve Rogers' case, it took super soldier serum and Vita rays in a secret experimental lab in New York to turn him into Captain America. In Henry Limpet's case, all it took was a lifelong obsession with fish and studying something called reverse evolution and then making a wish while leaning off the pier at Coney Island. I wish I were a fish because fish have a better life than people, says Limpet. And the magic spell happens. He falls into the water. He's presumed drowned when his body isn't found. After all, as his henpecking wife wails, he can't swim.
Henry can't swim.
But Henry has been transformed into a fish who can talk and who still needs to wear glasses. And that's an important point to remember. Also, for the purposes of this podcast, we recognize that The Incredible Mr. Limpet is not, strictly speaking, science fiction, but it does fall somewhere between science fiction and magic realism. It takes place in the real world before, during, and after World War II and references actual battles. The specific means by which Limpet is changed into a fish is hand-waved away. But the science fiction elements that drive the plots in so many stories about time travel or faster-than-light spacecraft are also usually waved away. In the early days of science fiction, when men like Hugo Gernsback walked the earth, writers were mostly engineers and other tech nerds who spent a lot of time explaining the gadgets and the hyperdrives and whatever over and over again in loving detail. These writers were eventually displaced by other writers who might also be engineers or chemists, but were not obsessed with the gears and levers, who felt they should be referenced only as much as necessary to advance the plot and develop the character. And I would argue the stories got better.
Oh, much better.
For a
much
general
better.
Readership, that, you didn't have to spend 4 pages on the engines and you could talk about the characters and what they were trying to do, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
One of the most famous examples of this improved writing is a line from an early Robert Heinlein story, quote, "The door irised open," unquote. But doors in our time don't iris open, do they? This is obviously a different time and place, probably the future, but Heinlein doesn't linger over it. You get this very visual picture in your mind of a door opening as a circle that gets bigger, like an iris. But the door just does what it does. People walk through it and the plot moves on. He doesn't spend 2 pages on the hydraulics of how this door opens. It just is a beautiful image of a different kind of door in the future.
There's also, and this is equally famous, or maybe a little bit less so, but in Terminator.
I was going to say Terminator.
Yeah.
I don't understand tech stuff.
I don't know tech stuff. When asked how this is possible, I don't know tech stuff. Just
Moving
don't worry
on.
about it. Yeah, moving on. It's a trope.
Exists,
Right.
and that's it.
It's a
Right.
trope in the genre. You get to use it, touch it and move on.
Right. Now, Henry Limpet falls into the water as Don Knotts.
Mm-hmm.
And then they switch to cartoon. They switch to animation. And his animated self slowly sinks. There are 3 bright jolts of light in quick succession. Henry Limpet is now a fish, and the plot moves on. In his new environment, Henry Limpet is now completely comfortable and in control. And interestingly enough, his lifelong study of fish now completely pays off.
Mm-hmm.
He recognizes the different species and where they live. He saves a ladyfish from a fisherman's hook and falls in love with her. He knows what part of the ocean he's in by the kind of fish that are swimming around him.
Mm-hmm.
And his new girlfriend is very much the opposite of his nagging wife. She's actually just completely enamored of Henry.
Oh, she loves him.
She loves him. And then Henry meets a grouchy old hermit crab, and they become best friends. But this time, Henry is the big, strong one. And in an encounter with a barracuda, Henry discovers he now possesses a powerful new weapon, his thrum.
Oh! Golly, did that come out of me?
With this sonic weapon, Henry can not only knock a shark on its ass, but he can locate and help destroy Nazi submarines.
Yeah.
And we're off to the races.
And now we're off.
Yeah.
The one thing you and I had both forgotten about the incredible Mr. Limpet was that almost the entire story is a flashback. It's all told in flashback. At the beginning of the movie, the very beginning of the movie, we follow 2 old Navy officers in the year 1963 or thereabouts into a top secret vault where they remove a top secret file from a top secret filing cabinet and talk about how they never thought they would ever have to open this file again. I thought we were done with this forever. How mysterious, eh? Top secret stuff going on. But the orders, quote, come straight from the top, unquote. And this next part of the story blew us away. In the present day of the film, which is roughly 1963, the military is doing, wait for it, cognitive research on dolphins, trying to prove they have complex brain structures, quote, maybe even superhuman brains, unquote. Holy crap.
I want to correct you just a minute. I think they say porpoises.
I don't know.
I believe they do say porpoises, but it is the same, genus of creature that is going to learn language. It's just remarkable. Yeah.
We're going to have to sit down, you and I, and watch the movie all over again after this. Yeah. But holy crap, we did not remember any of this when we picked these 2 movies at all. This was a mere coincidence or subconscious or whatever, but there's all these connections between these 2 movies. Anyway, these old Navy officers need to make contact with the dolphins or porpoises, whichever you prefer. So very reluctantly, they're going to try and make contact with him. Only then does the audience learn that him is the skinny, myopic Don Knotts, which, big laugh in theaters all over the country. Then we flash back to New York City a few months before Pearl Harbor. The main plot kicks off when Fish Henry Limpet spots a U.S. destroyer trying to sink a Nazi U-boat, and they miss. From somewhere out on the dark water, the crew of the destroyer hears Henry calling to them, telling them that they missed and offering to help. But they don't see anything. They shine a light out there. There's nothing there. They can't see anything. They suspect a Nazi trick. Eventually, the crew listens to him. They sink the submarine, but they're still very suspicious. This is the point at which the movie syncs up with, believe it or not, the 1942 novel by Theodore Pratt on which it was based, and the balance of the movie is Henry trying to convince the Navy that he exists, that he is friendly, and the chain of command slowly being convinced, but everyone higher up the chain doesn't want to hear any goddamn stories about a goddamn man turning into a fish. They will accept his help, but they are definitely not going to discuss who or what that help comes from. What is rendering assistance? And in other words, you're in for a solid hour of don't ask, don't tell.
Absolutely.
And
Absolutely.
that's when we both looked at each other and go, oh my God. Oh my God. And that made us sit up and take notice. Because intentionally or not, The Incredible Mr. Limpet can be seen as one of the most transgressive films ever made. Consider Henry Limpet has always hated his body and his life as a man. He is a dutiful husband, but his marriage makes him miserable, and he dreams of living in an entirely different life, in an entirely different body. Then, overnight, he is changed into the body he's always dreamed about, and he loves it. In his new life, he finds friends, he finds a new partner who he's crazy about and who's madly in love with him. During the movie, Henry Limpet muses several times that maybe all along he was supposed to be a fish. And while the last line of the 1959 classic Some Like It Hot is justifiably famous for being the greatest subversive comedy line in film history, spoiler, if you haven't seen the movie, don't listen now. The line is, nobody's perfect, and it's delivered by veteran character actor Joe E. Brown. We believe that the last line of The Incredible Mr. Limpet comes a close second. And here it is. In turning Henry Limpet into a fish, quote, maybe nature just corrected her error, unquote. Wow.
And
wow.
Mr. Limpet does not change back into a human being.
No.
And
No.
and everything restored. He remains a fish.
A happy
and
fish.
he is happy.
Mm-hmm.
I think that is so absolutely subversive.
Oh, God, yes. He's happier doing what he's doing. Now, the last sound you hear, not the last line, but the last sound you hear in the movie is Henry Limpet's thrum coming from somewhere out on the water. And when the credits roll, the words "the end" is followed by a question mark, which led us to believe that maybe there were some sequels planned that never came together. Now, just FYI, Don Knotts appeared in 87 movies and TV shows during his lifetime and did a whole lot of voice work during the back half of his career. And Mr. Limpet was his first time out as a voice actor.
He talks about that in one of the extras for this movie.
Yep.
On the DVD.
Mm-hmm.
And how he did Scooby-Doo a lot.
Yeah. Well, he was in Pleasantville.
Yeah.
He was the TV repairman in Pleasantville. He crops up a lot. You know, he was in Three's Company for a while and a bunch of other things that people might know him as, but he was married. He was like a real ladies' man in real life. He was married 3 times. He dated a lot. Apparently, he really, really liked ladies. But he always played this shaky, nervous, bragging, cowardly character. And he played him really well. My grandmother swore she couldn't stand Barney Fife because he made her nervous.
Mm-hmm.
And I was like, Grandma, he's supposed to make you nervous. He's supposed to just make you feel itchy all over. Anyway.
As with The Day of the Dolphin, we watched the hell out of everything we could find related to this movie, including a DVD featurette called Weekend at Wikiwachi about the massive press junket that preceded the 1964 release of this film.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I've been to Wikiwachi. It's in Florida. It's a 12,000-acre state park. It has a nature preserve, mermaid shows, and glass-bottom boat tours.
Mm-hmm.
And in January of 1964, while much of the rest of the country shivered, 250 reporters from around the world descended on Florida to spend the weekend enjoying the weather and interviewing celebrities for the release of this goofy movie. We watched these 1964 reporters with their heavy cameras and their typewriters and, you know, all the kind of clunky materials they had to carry with them on buses to get to Wikiwachi. And I looked at you and I said, this is 2 months after Kennedy was shot.
I know.
It's just an astonishing thing to look at this and say, boy, everybody's just moving on. You know, we're going to have a vacation in Florida. We're going to have mermaid babes to watch and drinks and partying.
Yeah.
You know, they were treated to the whole experience of Florida and boating and fishing and, you know,
in the
all
dead
the
of
things
winter.
Guys do. It was very heavily gender specific what kind of reporters went on these trips.
Yes, they were.
And they watched the movie, the premiere of the movie, in an auditorium looking through a tank at the movie that was being projected in the mermaid tank.
Right. The whole trick, the whole shtick was it's the first underwater release of a movie in history. And technically it was, and I'm like, okay, that's great. You put a screen underwater and showed a film. But man, they rolled out the red carpet and the press showed up in droves.
Yep.
And this
busloads of reporters to cover this movie. And so this little featurette was an amazing time capsule from an era that really almost seems like fiction itself. The studio system may have formally ended in 1948 with the Paramount Supreme Court case, but studios still had a lot of clout and a machine to run these movies through.
Mm-hmm.
This was Warner Brothers firing on all cylinders. They booked this camp for the weekend and had press flown in from everywhere. They had stars like Arthur Godfrey show up to glad hand the media. They had not only gotten the Navy to cooperate and virtually co-sponsor this movie, but Navy officials showed up at the screening to present a decree to Don Knotts and tell him he was awesome. And they acknowledge officially in a scroll that Don Knotts has contributed to naval recruitment.
Which is cool considering that the movie hadn't been released yet, so I don't know how they knew that.
Yeah, but we're going to give him a plaque anyway.
Yeah, but it was all very formal and official and handshakes and drinks and all around. Yeah.
Yeah. So this was 1964, a very brief period of time left when you could release a movie that was unabashedly flag-waving, pro-military, and pro-government, and no one would think twice about it. There is a lot of flag-waving going on in this movie.
Oh, yes. Oh, God, yes. Mm-hmm.
The movie is about a man fulfilling his patriotic destiny and desire by becoming a fish. But as with Captain America, that destiny consists of killing Nazis.
Yeah.
Lots of Nazis die in this movie. Now, this is, Mr. Limpet, so you never see blood or bodies, but you do see Nazi U-boats being depth charged and sunk all over the Atlantic. And they used, Navy film for this. You see Limpet turning the Nazis' own super weapon, Limpet-seeking torpedoes, back on them, sinking virtually the entire Nazi submarine fleet and paving the way for D-Day. He is finally honored by the Navy in a secret ceremony, but he's told that his existence must remain classified. Limpet's wife agrees that living together is no longer possible, and she's got a piece on the side with his best friend, the sailor.
They eventually get married. We find in the end that the two of them got married, so they're living together nicely.
Right. So she's not going to be left alone.
And she gets his Navy pension as well.
And she gets his Navy pension. So he leaves her, takes up with Ladyfish, who, again, adores him. And they swim off into history.
Yeah, it's quite remarkable. If you watch these movies back to back like we did, you really can hardly believe they come out of the same film industry just a decade apart. But that decade, that very specific decade between 1963 and 1973, which is sort of why we chose these two movies during this time frame, changed everything. Because consider between 1959, when the U.S. entered Vietnam formally, and 1963, a total of 195 American soldiers had died in a war that barely any Americans were aware of in a country called Vietnam. And despite the Korean conflict in 1963, the United States still thought of itself as the country which had defeated the Nazis and which had never lost a war. As a nation, we were still confident and arrogant and hopeful and more or less trusting in government and American business and businessmen. A decade later, that image of ourselves was completely in ruins. By 1973, 1 decade later, more than 57,000 Americans had died in Vietnam, and we were definitely losing. And as we've already mentioned, this was a decade of assassinations and riots and bombings, conspiracies, and learning almost every day that our government had been lying to us about a whole bunch of things. In 1963, the Nazis were still the bad guys, and you could make a family movie about becoming a fish and wanting to serve your country by killing Nazis, and nobody would think twice about it. Everybody thought, oh, that's kind of cute. We'll take the kids to go see a fish kill Nazis. That's great. But a decade later, the bad guys were us. In 3 Days of the Condor, they were the CIA. And in The Day of the Dolphin, they were a cabal of American businessmen and financiers who used their wealth to try to assassinate the president. And the good guys were intelligent, creative nerds who did not want to join the system. They just wanted to be left alone to do brain work, which turned out to be impossible because the work they wanted to do needed patrons to pay the bills. And in the end, those patrons turned out to be the bad guys.
There are at least two other much better known science fiction movies or movie franchises that fall into this category. The first, of course, is Star Trek IV: The Voyage Home, which also takes you to the oceans.
Mm-hmm.
And the second is the Jurassic Park movies, collectively. Instead of two intelligent dolphins living at an island preserve, the plot of Star Trek IV hinges on two intelligent humpback whales named George and Gracie, living in a Sausalito aquarium. And the rest of the plot is broadly the inverse of Day of the Dolphin. In the year 2286, the Earth is threatened with destruction by a powerful alien vessel that demands to speak with humpback whales, which in 2286 have long since been killed off by rapacious 20th century whale hunters. So instead of a malevolent conspiracy to kill a president, the crew of the Enterprise, which has traveled back to the year 1986, again, the way they do this is waved away as a mere inconvenience. They just go. And they are engaging in a benevolent conspiracy to kidnap or whale nap George and Gracie and take them back to the 23rd century, thus saving Earth and saving the whales, which have been scheduled to be released back into the ocean in a matter of days. In that way, it is very similar to Day of the Dolphin. This is a very pro-ecology movie. Both of these take the sides of the ocean creatures,
right?
And really to preserve them and save them is right. Part of the emotional connection.
But to save them, you don't release them into the ocean. To save them, you get them the hell away from the ocean. Right. And instead of George C. Scott swimming with them, it's Spock.
It's Spock
in the water, having a telepathic connection, finding out they're pregnant.
Right.
You know, that's
right. All of that good stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And the future from which the Enterprise crew comes actually resembles what 1963 America thought of themselves, much more than what 1973 America thought of itself. So far as we know, poverty, hunger, and war have all been eliminated in Kirk and Spock's world. The Federation is multiracial, multi-species. It's a force for good. And Starfleet is a hopeful, progressive instrument of exploration and discovery that only fights when it has to and only against really bad guys.
Yeah. And the really bad guys are always stand-ins for the Soviet Union or the communist China or whatever. Right. So we only fight against bad guys, and we're diplomats, and we were out to save everybody. And we want Kirk wants to sleep with everyone. That's the only real through line in all these movies. Now, the other set, the Jurassic Park movies, don't really belong in this category since the dinosaurs were genetically engineered from ancient scraps of DNA, and they're not intelligent creatures who were more or less here all along. However, we feel it does deserve honorable mention because of its villains. The villains are various reckless, greedy corporate types who want to exploit the dinosaurs for profit, and Vince D'Onofrio's Vic Hoskins, who is obsessed with turning raptors into military weapons. Both of these archetypes would feel right at home in any 1970s paranoid thriller.
Absolutely. Yep.
And finally, one shout out to my late friend Harlan Ellison and his story, A Boy and His Dog, which was a post-apocalyptic story, very heartwarming, about a boy, his intelligent telepathic dog, and a little light cannibalism.
Right. I do recommend, if you have a free weekend day, make it a movie day.
Yeah.
And pick a set of movies that you think might go together. We spent Saturday, started with, Friday night we watched Casablanca.
Right.
Then Saturday morning we watched 2001: A Space Odyssey, followed by Day of the Dolphin. And again, because we're doing this podcast, we went through all of the extras. We went through the commentary. We did, a few hours on this movie. And then it was, low energy. Our energy had been diminished a little bit. So that's when we put on The Incredible Mr. Limpet. And again, went through all of the extras. There is no film historian commentary overlaying the incredible Mr. Limpet?
There is now. I mean,
There
it's
is
us.
now. You can play this podcast while you're watching the movie.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, it was a great day. We just had a good time absorbing these movies and great day and a half.
Yeah.
It was very fun, Driftglass, watching all these fun movies with you.
And watching them watch movies because you love them and you enjoy them. Pair them nicely if you can do that. But we watch them for this podcast. We watch them for content. So I was taking notes, and then that moment came when we realized that The Incredible Mr. Limpet is all about people transforming their basic anatomy to become a happier person, and everybody's cool with that.
Yep.
Or living a different lifestyle entirely, even though
and realizing that nature made a mistake with me and I fixed it.
Yes. Because he was born this way, Blue Gal.
Yeah, born this way. He was born a fish. Yes.
And how, accidental or not, that's one hell of a weird message to be found in a kid's movie from 1963.
Yeah. Don't get me started on the term fish, all right?
Yeah. And on that note, let's remind people that Science Fiction University is a project of DGBG Productions. You can support this show and our wild purchasing habits of $3.95 videos that nobody else can find by donating via Patreon or PayPal. Details at our website, sciencefictionuniversity.com. And thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
See you next time.
See you next time.